Hello, friends. Welcome to Season 2 of the Club podcast. Each week, we bring you long-form conversations with the people building at the edges of crypto and community. At Seed Club, we believe in a world where people, not platforms, capture the value created online, and where community-owned networks are some of the most valuable organizations in the world. Join us for a front row seat to the latest insights and tactical learnings at the intersection of crypto and community. Today, I'm excited to bring you a conversation with Steve Klebanoff. Steve is a developer. He's worked at 0x Protocol, been involved in a number of NFT launches in the generative art space as an advisor to Artblocks, and most recently has been a contributor to Party DAO. I just found it fascinating talking to him about his early days getting into the space, about what he found so interesting about Ethereum as a platform, about why he was so enamored with generative art and what he did there and some of the early experiments around the NFT space. And then we finished off our conversation talking about Party DAO and its sort of genesis and ultimately where it's trying to go. I tried to get the alpha about V2 out. You'll have to wait and listen to see if we actually get that alpha. I can't tease too much like that. We didn't get the alpha, but really interesting to hear how they are thinking about the sort of multiplayer mode in NFTs and the types of things that get enabled by it. It's very obvious Steve is a brilliant human being. I think you'll find this conversation awesome, so let's get into it. Steve, welcome to Club.
Yo.
Actually, I was thinking back to our first conversation, and it must have been like 2020 sometime, because I pretty clearly remember being parked in a Walmart parking lot as I was running errands and having a conversation with you. I don't even remember what it was around exactly, other than I think you were just exiting 0x at some point. And it's funny just sort of reflecting back on how far we've come since the parking lot in Walmart. So why don't you just give us a brief intro who you are and what you're up to these days?
Yeah, well, first of all, I remember that conversation, and I feel like I've aged about 10 years since then. It feels like a short time in some ways, but a long time in other ways. But anyway, I'm Steve. I'm a software engineer, worked at 0x, and has done a lot of different things in the crypto ecosystem. Currently, along with my wife, Brianna, I do angel investing and do a variety of things in yield farming and DeFi, and also spend a lot of my time contributing to PartyDAO as well. And I have a history of working on some interesting NFT projects. Some notable ones are Zoo Token, which was the first fractionalized CryptoVoxels parcel. I also did a lot of work on this project called Rats.art, which was an art experiment in an art-based economy. I also did the Solidity smart contracts and contributed to the front end for the generative art NFT series Solvency by Ezra Miller, as well as more recently SilkRoad. And I'm also an advisor to a few different companies in the NFT ecosystem, the most notable one being Artblocks.
All right. I love how you've run down basically every single thing that I want to dive into discussing with you. So that was a great introduction. Thinking back to that early conversation that we had, my sense of it was it was sort of like this DeFi summer had just sort of happened, and there's sort of this like resurgence, or at least the first blip on what would ultimately become a fairly substantial bull market. I'm curious, if we sort of zoom out, what got you into this space and what made you so interested in a number of aspects of DeFi?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started getting interested in the space in like late 2016, reading about Ethereum on Reddit and investing in Ethereum kind of as a interesting technology and as a speculative asset. But then in early 2017, I actually started using Ethereum and using some of the early decentralized applications on there. And that really opened my eyes to how powerful this technology is. And it was powerful to me because it solved real problems that I had. So at the time, I was speculating on a lot of different coins, and I was primarily using Binance to do that. And if anyone else remembers like early 2017 Binance, there were a lot of problems with it. The site would go down. You could get your funds locked up and not be able to withdraw. They didn't have access to all the markets that you necessarily wanted. So I saw EtherDelta, which for those who don't know, it was like one of the earliest decentralized exchanges pre-Uniswap. And when I was using EtherDelta, even though it was very rough around the edges and ultimately didn't pan out to work that well, it showed me that these decentralized exchanges can run entirely on Ethereum smart contracts. So as long as the Ethereum network is up, this exchange will keep going. So I didn't have to worry about the downtime issues of Binance. It also allowed me to speculate on any token that I wanted, unlike Binance, which was limited just to the markets they supported. And it also presented some interesting market inefficiencies as well. So that showed me the power of Ethereum to run an exchange that couldn't be shut down, that was always up, and that allowed me to interact with any token that I wanted, compared to Binance that had uptime issues. And also EtherDelta allowed me to self-custody my funds as well, which was important to me. So it brought like uptime and security and access to markets that I couldn't get on a centralized exchange, and it did it all through Ethereum smart contracts. So that's what kind of got me pilled on decentralized applications, was seeing EtherDelta solve real problems that I had. So in interacting with EtherDelta and recognizing these market inefficiencies, I ended up first doing some manual arbitrage and then automating an arbitrage bot to arbitrage EtherDelta and Binance in order to generate some income on the side. And through that, I was introduced to 0x because I started automating interactions with Radar Relay, which was like an early 0x relayer. And I was really impressed with the 0x code base, really impressed with the team and the mission and the vision. And when I saw they were hiring, I decided to leave my traditional, pretty comfy software as a service, Ruby on Rails software engineering job and go into crypto full time in 2018 when I joined 0x. So that's kind of like my entry into working on crypto full time.
I remember those early days of Binance, and I don't even think I was sort of even introduced to the idea of like, that's very early to EtherDelta was in like a very nascent stage, even back at that time. I remember, I think, being introduced to it in like 2019 and still seeing it, still attempting to take shape. So the sense I got from following your work and speaking with you, a while ago, was there was sort of this aspect of almost like building your own vending machine in this sort of Ethereum world. Not only are you just sort of using these tools, but you as a software developer sort of saw those skills as superpowers to start to make, I think we call them money Legos now. But I'm curious, what were some of the things that you talked about an arbitrage bot. What were some of the other things that you've kind of built to experiment with, profit from, play with in that space?
Yeah, so ultimately, I feel like as a software engineer, I'm lucky enough to have these skills that kind of do afford me what I consider to be like superpowers to build new things. And prior to crypto, a lot of the things that I was building were kind of limited to small scale hackathon projects that maybe I shared with some coworkers or shared on Product Hunt or whatever, but it never really felt like I was building things that people were actually using and that I could actually generate income from. So when I recognized the power of Ethereum smart contracts and Web3 software development, that's where things really changed for me, where I could take a kind of creative outlook on software engineering and use it to build things that people actually interact with, that actually hold like non-trivial amounts of money and actually like derive some real value, compared to just these little hobby projects that were just sitting on my hard drive and didn't have a big benefit. And I think part of what got me really excited was this idea that every single application built on Ethereum is an open API by default. So I came from the traditional Web2 software engineering world. I was working on a payments platform for a while in the Web2 world, and having to deal with Web2 payments is such a hassle for quite a few different reasons. But one of the reasons is that there are all of these APIs that are gatekept by these institutions. And in order to even get access to move money around, you need to negotiate a big deal. You need to get an API key. You need to deal with some outdated XML-based API and go through all these hoops. And then at the end of the day, it might go down or not work as you expect, and everything's closed source. So the fact that on Ethereum, that every single application that was built on Ethereum, I was free to write interactions with without any gatekeepers, without any worries about downtime or API keys or APIs changing, that was really powerful to me and showed me some of the power and beauty of what it means to really have like a open and accessible technology that any software engineer can use to mash up different things without being limited by any gatekeepers. So that's one of the things that got me really excited. And that doesn't even touch on the payments issues with ACH transfers and chargebacks on credit cards and all the things that can go wrong when you're dealing with Web 2 payments compared to Web 3 payments that are all transparent on chain and you have certainties about how they will interact. So those are some things that got me really jazzed on the ecosystem. And overall, those things kind of shaped my mindset that overall, I'm not trying to just recreate the existing Web 2 world in like a Web 3 way. Overall, when I look at projects to invest in or things to hack on or people to collaborate with, I look at how can we use these kind of new superpowers of the Web3 technology, whether it be everything's an open API, all the contracts are open source, everything is composable, things like that, to try to create new things that really leverage and flex that novel capabilities and try to build things that just couldn't be done in the Web 2 world and are only possible in the Web 3 world. And I think that through projects like Rats or even Solvency and SilkRoad and Party DAO, you can kind of see that spirit behind those projects.
As this sort of wave, or I guess the tide of the latest bull market kind of goes out, it seems to be in vogue for people to be very vocal online around why crypto won't work or why Web 2 is just so much better than Web 3 and Web 3 doesn't really have any legs to stand on. People are obviously poking fun at folks who maybe have a challenge to actually clearly articulate the value of something like Ethereum or of Web3 tools generally. As you're sort of explaining that, your position or thinking around this, two things sort of stand out. One, the world of Ethereum or DeFi, Web3 has changed so much since you got into the space today. And so I feel like you have an interesting perspective on the delta there. And then two, it seems as if as a developer, there's just so clearly obvious benefits to this sort of new platform. And I think we've seen, I think Chris Dixon posted a piece yesterday or the other day around framing growth in technology as epochs that are really built on new platforms that are being launched and new things launched on top of them, the iPhone being maybe most notable. I'm curious how you respond, or how do you articulate clearly the value that you as a builder really see in being able to build in the space in something like Ethereum?
I think that as a software engineer, once you kind of see the benefits of the Web3 ecosystem with everything being transparent, all the code being open source, everything being composable, and like seeing the power of this distributed virtual machine that can't be stopped by like any government or central like entity. And then again, when you kind of dig into the actual applications that are being built in it and let your mind wander to the creative things that this unlocks, you can't really unsee it or go back. Now, for example, when I think back to some of the work I was doing with payments in the Web 2 world, I think about how so many pieces of software, for example, all the payments and all like, let's say payments for an invoice for some company and who paid them and how they paid them and the reference number, et cetera. Like these are stored in a centralized database that a lot of Web 2 companies don't even have great security practices around. So thinking about a centralized database with a bunch of critical payment information in it that some intern at some company could accidentally delete or change all the numbers in, like seeing that compared to like transparent open source like software that deals with payments, like you can't really unsee that difference in my opinion as a software engineer. And you kind of go from thinking about what do I want to trust? Do I want to trust like an open source, immutable smart contract with like very clear rules that everyone can see how it works and all the transactions going in and out, even though there's obviously smart contract risk and we've seen smart contracts blow up plenty of times. But do you want to trust that, or do you want to trust a centralized database that interns have access to that could be exposed or unencrypted, or payments could get messed up, etc.? So I think it's really hard once you kind of enter that Web3 world to go back to the alternative. So as a software engineer, there just are huge benefits that I think are really, really here to stay, combined with the open API access and all the mashups that you can make. And the recent blowups of some, centralized finance firms and comparing them to the decentralized exchange firms kind of like shows the balance of, centralized databases behind closed doors versus like open source DeFi projects. Not to say that those DeFi projects are perfect. We've seen plenty of problems with them, but it's just a really interesting thing to compare the different levels of risk and transparency, with the two options that are presented to you as a software engineer.
Yeah, I always think about just like, okay, let's take those two starting points and draw a long time horizon. To me, the risks and challenges around DeFi have a higher likelihood of being solved because of the transparency and the openness, and the things like 3AC and Celsius and those that do not have the bleaching power of sunlight. unless something goes wrong, you're never going to see that. And I think there's just sort of like timelines are a thing I think a lot about, because so much of value that's in this world gets created through compounding, right? So it's like effort over
Hmm.
time, values in the market over time. And yet crypto has like 6 month, 8 month, 2 month, 2 week
Hmm.
timelines
Hmm.
that we're sort of looking at so often. And I think it's just very helpful to often zoom out a little bit. And, I think about the difference between our first conversation and today, and then your experience even goes back even further.
Hmm.
It's hard to articulate. I got in the space in early 2017, and to articulate those early days of Binance
Hmm.
and the different type of bullshit that was being done there. It's still bullshit today, but it's like
Hmm.
very different back then. And to be able to articulate that if you haven't been there is kind of tough. And so, yeah, I guess we relearn these things time and time again. But, I share the same, I'm not even going to call it optimism. It's just conviction in the net new possibilities that get created through a platform like Decentralized Ledger, big open source L1.
I think it's also interesting to see some of the patterns that, you and I saw in like 2017 kind of get played out in different ways these days, right? Where in like 2017, it was all about the ICO craze, right? Where people are raising tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for an ICO token with a fancy white paper that says that, they're going to solve, some big problem in the world with big fancy words and optimistic roadmaps and really big promises to people. And they were selling ERC20s. So we saw people fancy white papers, like ambitious ideas, tens or hundreds of millions of dollar valuations on ERC20s, right? And now it feels like we have some of that same energy, but just with a different scale and kind of like with different expectations around it, right? So we've gone from that ICO energy to NFT energy, where instead of raising tens or hundreds of millions of dollars for a project, people might raise a few $1 million or a few tens of millions of dollars, and instead of having a fancy PDF white paper with a lot of fancy words, they have a fun website with some nice JavaScript and claim that maybe they'll make a game and donate some stuff to charity, right? But there's some sort of similar, and they're selling 721s instead of ERC20s, right? So it's like the form is different, the market is different, the promises are different, but it's kind of interesting to see that same sort of kind of like speculative ICO level energy play out, just like with a different form factor, different group of people, and different scale as well. And the same thing, we saw algorithmic stablecoins like empty set dollar and dynamic set dollar kind of like pop off with some kind of like quote unquote Ponzi style mechanics. They died for a while, that went quiet, and then kind of Ohm and Wonderland and all of these things that are definitely not the same as empty set dollar, but some similar kind of like high APY, like, quote unquote Ponzi-nomics come back with a different flavor and since have died off, right? So it's interesting. I tend to think that it's pretty fascinating just to watch like kind of like similar energies or like some similar core ideas kind of play out in different form factors, like over the scale of time.
Yeah, it makes me think about like what is human desire to speculate or to gamble, or there's a certain aspect of that which is like, why am I going to YOLO into this smart contract as ERC20s or 721s? It's because I hope that at some point in the future, hopefully a very near future, it's going to be worth a 10x, 100x, 1000x, which I think I'm a fan of speculation, or I think somebody the other day called it as risk taking, right? Like we're putting capital up. Generally, that capital, if invested well, is going towards a likelihood of creating some change in the world. And so much of the tools we're talking to each other around right now are because of that speculation. And there's whole industries around it right now. I think like pure speculation without, I guess, the word utility or without value creation that kind of comes out from it seems to be not super useful. So like if you look back on sort of that early, let's go 2017 to DeFi summer, like what do you think came out of that era that was meaningful and lasting? And maybe if we sort of think about this next era we're moving into as sort of a rhyme of it, what do you think might come out of this next one?
That's a great question. I'm curious for your opinion on this as well, since you've been around and seen these cycles as well. In terms of the original DeFi summer, I feel like there's a lot. It's just like experimentation on steroids in like a very like fast like time cycle, right? It's like we saw experiments in different types of token mechanics, like governance tokens versus like fee tokens versus projects without tokens, and then like SushiSwap coming out and like being a Uniswap clone but with a token, and then Uniswap quickly releasing a token after that, and then no offense to SushiSwap, but then Uniswap like came out with a very impressive Uniswap v3 that was like very kind of novel innovation with regards to on-chain market making, where SushiSwap
like kind of forked Uniswap v2, put a token on top of it, and then kind of went broad and trying to create all these different products instead of doubling down on market making, right? So we saw like, what is it like for vampire attacks to occur? How do people value tokens, whether they're just purely governance or if they actually accrue fees? We also learned a lot about how regulation is potentially shaping up and different approaches that people take towards DAOs and different kind of safety precautions you can put in from a regulatory perspective to be less likely to be perceived as a security. And now we're kind of seeing the introduction of NFTs as a new type of speculative asset that now DeFi protocols are even adopting as well, and they kind of like reach a new type of consumer that maybe is a little bit less sophisticated when it comes to being experienced traders and knowing how to, read charts and look at order books and understand liquidity. But now there's people with a significant amount of capital that are speculating, but just they know how to speculate on OpenSea and with NFTs as well, right? So we've seen like the vehicle of speculation evolve from just purely kind of like ERC20s, which might be more familiar to somebody who, trade stocks or options or something like that, to 721s, which feel more like they might feel more comfortable with somebody who's used to like trading cards or like CSGO skins or something like that. But there's still a significant amount of liquidity and volume there and speculation happening. So there wasn't a great answer in terms of what we're learning, but just kind of a brain dump about all the different experimentation that we're seeing and kind of how it's evolving, which I think is just pretty fascinating to think about.
Yeah, I think it maybe isn't even like the best way to ask that question, because I saw a tweet, I think it was from Fred or some, who was talking about, just theorizing around where we are in the adoption cycle. And if you zoom out look at the internet at large, there was 50 years or so of like deep tech development that were building the infrastructure that ultimately led to the modern internet through the late 90s, and then ultimately more infrastructure being built, but more attention at least on it through till today. And he was sort of suggesting that the big difference in today with crypto is that because of tokens and because of the speculative aspects of it, people are actually paying attention to this technology way earlier. But that and that maybe that helps to advance the development of this infrastructure, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to make it overnight. And so a common critique you say is like, oh well, Bitcoin's these things have been around for 10-12 years, why aren't we seeing like mass market adoption? And really people are indexing on the last 10 years of awareness around the internet and missing out on all the technological advancements that were required to be able to get to that point. And so, I think it just in your answer there, I think, yeah, those are experiments. Those experiments come fast and heavy. They get proven or disproven in the market very quickly. They are composable and adapted and reconfigured. And, I think there are some pretty clear tools that have come out of this. The fact that you can have a market for anything is a massive shift from back in the day when I first got into the space. Like that has enabled everything that we do is enabled because of that shift, right? And we're seeing a ton of energy going into thinking about how to scale blockchains, and like these things aren't maybe as sexy, and they're not like the decentralized Uber or autonomous DAO owned transportation networks that were the thing that got me super excited early on. But there's definitely progress being made there. And I do think what's interesting about this last cycle is that NFT, the idea that it is just so much more comfortable to go buy something off of OpenSea than it is to go put an order into Uniswap, which is far more comfortable than it is to go. I mean, I signed up for some weird exchanges to get access to early projects back in 2017 that definitely rugged me. I'm sure my KYC information is out of the dark web somewhere. Like that was not a good vibe. And so those are like meaningful improvements, and also have like brought that attention or access to a whole lot of new people. And I think in the space that we play in, that's really exciting because the folks that are being creative, whether that's with technology or with art, whatever their medium is, really have new tools. And I use the word, as we say, tokens give community superpowers, because it is these the tools that folks like yourself build are these just magic boxes that, if put together in an interesting way, can really have a major impact on community, on an area that one might care about, or on even just sort of advancing the space generally. So I think it's hard to be able to point to like, here's the specific outcomes that have changed the world. Like people want the Airbnbs, they want the Facebook, they want the Google, and yet we're still at like, I mean, I don't even know what era we're at here, but like the internet is not, we're not even at AOL yet, I think.
I'm going to take this analogy that Will Warren from ZeroX spoke about, and he spoke about that Tesla, like when it started out, made these expensive, like roadster style cars that were basically meant for like affluent hobbyists, right? So there was like this toy phase that Tesla went through where, yeah, we're making these expensive cars. They're meant for hobbyists, like they might be buggy. And that was kind of the toy phase. And similar in the Ethereum and DeFi and NFT ecosystem, it still kind of feels like we're very much in this toy phase where it's largely hobbyists that are interacting with it. There are bugs. It's hard to interact with. It's easy to get wrecked. Still today, it's so easy to get rugged or get wrecked in today's ecosystem. But those hobbyists that are like the affluent hobbyists that are, willing to buy the expensive machinery or invest the time in learning on how the system works, and they're pouring money into it because it's an interesting technical thing, just like the original kind of hobbyists on computers or the people that were purchasing Teslas, they added the capital to help Tesla evolve into, at the end of the day, making more of a like accessible car for closer to the average person to purchase, right? So what started off as kind of like a expensive hobbyist item is like kind of like morphing into turning into that company being able to produce like a $35,000 car that's more accessible for the average person and like much safer and easier to deal with. So I still like we're very much still kind of in a toy phase where it's largely hobbyists that are interacting with this. It's really easy to get wrecked. The tools are not really ready for super big widespread adoption as much as we'd like them to be and as much as people would like to make it sound like we are. We're still kind of in this like speculative hobbyist playing around with this weird technology, but adding all this capital to the ecosystem that at the end of the day will help this evolve into something that's more accessible and ready for mainstream usage. But I think we're pretty far away from that. When you just think about buying scammed like NFTs on OpenSea, screwing up nonces when you're submitting a transaction, upping gas costs, saving private keys, hardware wallets. Like it's important for us to recognize and zoom out for a minute and think about your non-techie friend interacting with all the stuff that we do every day. And I still think we're still very much in a hobbyist phase.
Yeah, I think the complication here is that there's a lot of incentive to suggest that we are not in that phase anymore and that give me money and this world is right there. And yet I think that's like ultimately very detrimental to users, to those who are looking from the outside and calling bullshit and probably rightfully so about much of it. So what I love about speaking with you and getting to see the work you've done is that, you are very active in building in this world. And there's like a number of, it seems to be a fairly clear through line through a lot of the work you're doing. And at the same time, kind of some interesting choices here as well. So I wanted to sort of jump into a few of these. Off the bat, you sort of mentioned Zoo Token, which is definitely a flashback to when I hung out in Crypto Voxels, kind of, but also was sort of very interested in this idea of like, fractionalized real estate and fractionalized digital real estate. You can own part of a zoo. Like, it reminds me of the time where you're just throwing wild shit at the wall and it was just like, there's like no expectations associated with it. So like, why the hell wouldn't you go do those things specifically? If you could describe that project and maybe some of the lessons that came out of it.
Yeah, definitely. So that was actually part of a 0x hackathon project that I worked on with a few people at 0x. And this was like early Crypto Voxels days where when I was introduced to NFTs, one of the first NFTs I bought was a Crypto Voxels parcel. And because I got introduced to the WIP, the work in progress meetup that Rizzle and some of like the NFT OGs hosted. And that was where I felt like the quote unquote metaverse was at the time, where they held these weekly meetings in Crypto Voxels and people got to show off their NFT projects for the first time there. And that was even where like Proof of Beauty was introduced for the first time, I believe. That was like Artblocks was introduced there, like pre-launch or like right after launch. Like some really prominent projects were launched there, and that felt like a very special community at the time. So when I saw Crypto Voxels, which had like a very kind of like punk rock experimental vibe with like these kind of degenerate NFT artists and like what kind of morphed into some of like the trash art NFT movement with like a few different important characters there. I thought that was a really interesting place to experiment with just some wild or interesting ideas. So for the hackathon project, I wanted to write some interesting Solidity code that people would actually use and this kind of became a pattern for me and some of my other work that like used Solidity smart contracts to experiment with like ideas about social coordination or like new ways to create artwork as well. So what we did is we bought a CryptoVoxels parcel in the Bronx neighborhood in CryptoVoxels and commissioned Ogar, pretty dope NFT architect, to build the zoo there, and we called it the Bronx Zoo. So we put up our own ETH to do that, and then we wrote a smart contract to mint a token called the zoo token that gave people partial ownership of the zoo. And when we were thinking about how can we do that in a way that really gives them partial ownership, we came up with this mechanism that we deposited the parcel itself into the smart contract, and then we minted what I believe was 10,000 zoo tokens. And then at the work in progress meetup, we launched this project where we gave tokens out to the neighbors, which I think was a pretty interesting idea, for free. We gave them to some architects in the ecosystem. Some were sold and some were left in a treasury. And then we said how the smart contract works is that on 4/20, on April 20th, the zoo will be sold in a Dutch auction, which the smart contract facilitated. So there was an end date to this kind of art experiment. On April 20th, the zoo was going to be sold. And then when it's sold, zoo token holders could claim their proceeds of the ETH from the sale. So by giving somebody a zoo token, you're kind of incentivizing them to help grow the value of the zoo. So by giving it to the neighbors, we were thinking, can we incentivize neighbors in this virtual neighborhood to make this neighborhood nicer because they have now potential financial upside if this neighborhood and thus the zoo parcel becomes more valuable because it will be sold on a specific date and they could benefit from it. So that was the idea of giving it to the neighbors. And then also we held some in a treasury, and then we had voting for how to spend that money in a treasury. So we had some different ideas that came up and a proposal or two that went through about, okay, should we sponsor the work in progress meetup? Should we pay this person to make a meme? And should we do these things? So now you had a group of people that were kind of governing the zoo with the tokens that they bought or were gifted to them, all with the idea of can they be incentivized to kind of grow value in that space with this upcoming auction date in which they get a portion of the proceeds. So that's what the zoo token was about. It was an experiment in like, what does it mean to have communal ownership of a virtual place, and what does it mean to be able to govern that place communally and to like give people that live around that place access to the upside of this kind of communal piece of property. So really fun and interesting experiment, and big shout out to everybody who contributed to that code with me, as well as like the work in progress crew that like helped us throw a really awesome event in the zoo that we have a little postcard NFT of when we threw a pretty fun party when we launched the zoo at the WIP meetup.
Yeah, shout out the whip, solid human beings. I love that experiment because the old adage of like, you and I, we mint 100 tokens and we hold 50 each. And are they worth something? Are they not? They're probably worth not a whole lot. But we started giving those tokens away to a few people, and all of a sudden the potential value starts to grow as, there's the network is ultimately expanding. And, I think there's so many of the experiments we're seeing in Web3 are a version of that ultimately. And this idea of making that, increasing the surface area of incentive and word of mouth and sharing and all the other things that sort of come from giving ownership away, I think is fascinating.
One more thing about that as well is that like, I think that what that also taught me is to not be afraid to kind of have fun with these experiments and make them goofy and make them have character and like a sense of aesthetic. And I think that it's one thing to launch a smart contract that people could deposit like an arbitrary, NFT into and then have tokens and have a Dutch auction and be like, hey, here's this platform, come and, fractionalize your parcels or whatever. Like that probably would have gotten little or no usage, right? It's a very different thing to be like, hey, not only are we going to develop the smart contract, but we are going to make a really interesting event that has a sense of character and aesthetic and fun to it and kind of like organize this canonical instance of this that has like community and a vibe, as opposed to just trying to release like a bland platform and hoping that other people use it. So that was one of, I think, the important lessons of that project.
I feel like that's a lesson that a lot of folks are learning, myself included, just even around thinking about, say, ERC20s versus 721s, right? And you can do a comparison chart of the relative values or benefits that come out of it. And, depending on the type of project, maybe, but there's this, like, around it all is this idea of vibes or culture or memeability. And it's a thing that I think is really tough to sort of like analyze your way through. But for those that have, I mean, you mentioned being an advisor to Artblocks, like so much of the joy of early minting of Artblocks is you just didn't know what you were going to get. And yet there was something special about that. And people's identity were built on top of it. All these things that you just sure as hell wouldn't have just in holding 5 ERC20 tokens, but five squiggles, like, let's fucking go.
Hell yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people that are transitioning into the Web3 world from Web2 world, they're used to being able to, read some article on Hacker News about the right way to do things and kind of like compare different technical benefits or downsides of certain things. But there's a lot in Web3 that comes down to culture, like vibes and aesthetic that I think people are learning and becoming more hip to.
Yes, consider myself a participant in that journey. I'm really curious about the Rats.art project, because this is one that I remember seeing you sort of build out in the open and be right in the middle of development of, and yet sort of was always a watcher from the outside. So I'm really curious if you could sort of explain what you were going for there and where that ended up.
Yeah, definitely. So when I left 0x, I gave myself a few months to just be open to whatever seemed interesting to me without a strong focus on having to make money. And I gave myself a 2 or 3 month time limit to do that. So when I was in that kind of state of mind, I met Jay DeLay, who's an artist and he is pretty closely associated with the trash art ecosystem and has always had some kind of novel ideas when it comes to art distribution and ownership, etc. So he had started a project called the Spam Token Project, where people were sending him whatever junk NFTs they had, and he was giving them some ERC20 spam token that he minted on some platform, but he was doing this all manually. And he was like, can we automate this? Can we be like, hey, can you send a token to a contract and then it gives them spam tokens because I'm losing money spending gas for doing this, but people really like the idea of just having this kind of communal contract with all these donated NFTs in it. So I said, yeah, we could do that, but wouldn't it be interesting if we took it farther? How could we jam on this more? We have the superpowers to write smart contracts that interact with NFTs. How could we take this further? So what we ended up building was Rats, which is just an experiment in an art-based economy. So how it worked is that if you have an NFT, you can donate it to the Rats smart contract. And when you do that, you have two options. You can either trade it for another piece of artwork that's in the smart contract. So I have an NFT. There's this NFT I want in the Rats vault is what we call it. I can just swap it out. So it'd be like if you were at an art gallery, you went into a room, there was a bunch of pieces of art on the ground, and if you had a piece of art, you could just swap one for one with one that was kind of on the ground in this room, right? So that was cool idea, just to be able to kind of share ideas and art without any real kind of monetary incentive around it. But then also there was this idea of the Rats token, where you could give a piece of artwork, but instead of taking a piece of artwork, you could receive a Rats token. And a Rats token was just a little voucher that would allow you to get a piece of artwork from that vault for free in the future. So it's just kind of an IOU, a piece of art. And then to make it a little bit more fun or interesting, we added a limited supply of those Rats tokens, of 1,000 Rats tokens. So basically the first 1,000 people to deposit art without taking anything out would be able to get a Rats token, which would allow them to redeem that token in the future. So that means if you have a Rats token, you can watch the vault, and then when you see something interesting, you can redeem your Rats token instead of having to scramble to get some NFT to donate to swap it out. So really just an art project to create an art-based economy, right? If you have a piece of art, you can always get a piece of art. Or if you have a Rats token, which you got from donating a piece of art, you can use it to redeem a piece of art. So this was kind of something that was refreshing to a lot of people at the time that were getting a little bit burnt out on the monetary kind of implications of all the speculation around NFTs and artwork. And this was just something that was built purely as an experiment, purely as an art project to help facilitate people transferring ideas, distributing artwork. And there were some interesting use cases of people that might be up and coming artists, or maybe OGs in the art ecosystem, just wanting to distribute their artwork in a way that wasn't always tied to doing an auction or selling on Rarible or whatever. So there were some pretty interesting and what turned out to be some pretty valuable pieces that were deposited in there. And it was really interesting too to see what people traded for? So did people, if they were taking what they perceived as a valuable piece, did they donate a valuable piece or did they donate a trash piece, right? Because there was no limits on what, having to trade for a price that you perceive to be a similar value. So it was also kind of a test of like ethics and character of the people that were interacting with it in this permissionless system. So overall, just really, really interesting experiment that I'm grateful to have linked up with the people that I did to build it.
Tell me how you got into the generative art space. And you mentioned Solvency and SilkRoad.art and Artblocks. These all are sort of very impactful, unique projects in the space. Is this something that you sort of been into before crypto, or was there sort of like a convergence? Because I sort of see this like DeFi, and then I see this sort of playing in the NFT space, and then maybe I'm making up a story here, but saying like those two things coming together being a really interesting intersection.
Yeah, so I was using Artblocks on day one, where I was just like very much, involved with attending the WIP meetups and like being on, crypto art Twitter. So when I saw Artblocks launch, like I minted a Squiggle and it was like a Genesis, and like I minted NFTs from there. And I thought the outputs were really interesting. And I thought just the joy of not knowing what you were going to get. And not just that I didn't know, but that the artist who wrote the code didn't know what piece I was going to receive. Like when I minted, I found that pretty fascinating. And then as a software engineer, as I dug into the smart contract and understood how it worked, I had not been like a fan or like known really anything about generative art prior to this. So when I saw it, I was like, oh, wow, it's like, this is JavaScript that's generating the artwork. That JavaScript is stored on chain, so it like will forever live on, like as long as Ethereum is around. And then a pseudo random hash is generated when I click the mint button that's fed into the JavaScript. So I understood kind of technically how no one could know what I was going to mint, not even the artist. And I found that just profoundly interesting. And I think that relates to the overall spirit of like NFTs as a whole are interesting because they take things that existed, in the existing kind of like physical art world and kind of put them on steroids. Like there's on-chain provenance, there's, secondary market fees that go to the artist. There's like some level of permanence to the artwork. So it kind of took things that existed in the real world and kind of put them on steroids and put them on chain. And I think that's great. It's interesting. It's cool. But what I'm more interested in is like, what about things that couldn't even or didn't even exist in the real artwork world that are uniquely enabled by blockchain technology? And that's what Artblocks was to me, right? So it wasn't just, I'm going to take an image that I painted and put it on chain and have the provenance and the secondary fees. Like that just feels like taking the existing world and putting it on chain, which is great. But Artblocks is like, no, this really couldn't be done in the real world. To have like a provably random seed generate a piece of artwork and then have it revealed to you in real time that now you own, and there's the provenance of you minting it and all the different on-chain conditions that cause that like pseudo-random hash to generate. And then with the actual combined with, again, not just being a platform that anybody could mint on and anyone could write up their own generative artwork, but combined with Snowfro's like curation and taste and care for the actual artwork. So like every time you mint, you have the joy of the novel technology powering this, but then you also have that paired with curated, interesting artwork appearing on the site that just brought me so much joy when I minted for all those different reasons. So that's what got me really into generative artwork. Again, creating something novel that can only kind of exist on chain compared to just putting stuff that existed in the real world and, putting it on chain. That was like a 0 to 1 moment for me where I like got in touch with Snowfro. I ended up building a Discord bot to alert all the mints so everybody could vibe out and see all the mints together as they were created. And that led me towards becoming close friends with Snowfro, helping him like raise his first round and like guide him on a technical level before he had like full-time other software engineers working on the project. So very grateful for that project.
Yeah, just thinking back to the good old gas wars around the middle stages of that project as people were, it was just crazy to see the attention that kind of came around it in a fairly short period of time. And yeah, I actually got to meet Eric for the first time in Austin a couple of weeks back. And all those things that you said are true. And also the man is an absolute empath and brilliant community person that I think I watched some of the stuff he did early on with a member of Squiggle DAO, and was having a bad day and giving them a squiggle mint into their wallet just because they had, it was just like, I'm like, this guy's playing 4D chess and it's not even chess because he just gives a shit at that level. Anyways, this is our Snowfurrow appreciation part of this podcast.
Love Snowfurrow for sure. Like those early days of Artblocks had gas wars, but then they also had like squiggles, that didn't mint out with the gas war. And I just loved
Oh yeah.
those days of being in Discord. Like even when there was a gas war, though, like people were seeing the artwork for the first time. They were sharing what they got. That you were like discovering the series together as it was created on chain, which is like a very special thing that like I've tried to like kind of help recreate like with the way that we architected the SilkRoad drop. And like I think those people that were in the Artblocks Discord for some of those early mints, like I think those were pretty formative for a lot of people, including myself.
Punk's Discord, Work in Progress, Artblocks Discord. Like you could trace so much of the art pedigree to those three places, which I think is fascinating. I love that this is a DAO podcast generally, and yet I'm waiting until we have a few minutes left to actually get into the only project that's here that says the word DAO in it. And I'm recognizing and maybe hopping over, Solvency.art, SilkRoad.art. Go check out those projects. They're generative. Is there anything you want to say like that's specific or unique, maybe shortly around that? Because I do want to make sure we get into your Party DAO life.
So with SilkRoad and Solvency, I partnered with an artist named Ezra Miller, not the Ezra Miller that's the actor and been in the news, but a different Ezra Miller, who's the man, a good friend of mine now. And we basically took a lot of that technology that Artblocks did, but made our own bespoke version of it to do things that Artblocks wasn't capable of doing at the time, largely using external assets that are stored on Arweave and like tightly controlling like the presentation and the minting experience and the smart contract as well to do a generative mint, but one of the first like bespoke generative mints outside of Artblocks that just had some constraints that Artblocks couldn't support. And it was a real joy to work on that because it is really, I think, powerful and impressive and meaningful artwork. And it also kind of showed me all the different technological pieces that you need to have in place to have an Artblocks style experience, which is like a non-trivial amount of pretty interesting technical work as well. So yeah, very, very proud and happy with Solvency and SilkRoad, which are those two generative art projects I collaborated with Ezra on.
I think Ezra has the best website on the internet. The fact that you have to go through pipes to get to the other section of like, I don't know, I love that. I'm in this very like Web 1 and Web3, but fuck Web2 type vibe and aesthetically and maybe just philosophically as well. And so I love that.
Hell yeah.
Okay, my first experience with Party DAO was seeing I saw Dennis as a friend, I saw Dennis's tweet, I saw, sort of this thing happen. All of a sudden there's a crowdfund on Mir, and of course I'm like, oh, let's go by, just support this sort of thing. And it kind of just went crazy since then. And all of a sudden this whole new sort of multiplayer language was in the world of NFT collecting and auctions. And now, of course, there's sort of been a round of funding and a whole big vision that's being, executed against in Party DAO. So I would actually love to hear how you were sort of describing what Party DAO is today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to understand Party DAO, what it is today, it is important to like understand its creation story because that's pretty like core to the culture and the vibe of what Party DAO is. So you're exactly right, is that Party DAO started a little bit over a year ago via a Mirror crowdfund where we raised like 25 ETH at the time, and with this idea that people should be able to participate in NFT auctions as a group. So this started off with just Dennis tweeting about this idea, and then Anish, the GOAT, developing a very rough prototype of it over the weekend, and then a crowdfund coming out to take that prototype and develop it even further. And that was like the whole kind of goal of the crowdfund. And then I ended up contributing to the crowdfund, and then shortly after I joined the Discord, and then I saw John Palmer in there, which I had actually known from the Solvency Discord. I didn't know him prior to Solvency, but when we released Solvency, he minted it on day one, and he was obsessed with it, going into detail about like all the subtle characteristics of all these different mints, especially the ones that were considered random. And he was like a true like head collector of Solvency. And then I got to know him through that Discord. And then I saw he contributed to Party DAO, and he put in a proposal to be the PM to help get the V1 of Party DAO out. And And because he knew my work from Solvency, he reached out to see if I wanted to contribute. I was pretty busy at the time, so I just agreed to contribute a few hours a week towards like helping with Solidity review and Solidity architecture. And then Anna was the one who wrote the initial smart contracts for PartyDAO, that initial version of PartyDAO. And then we had a whole like slew of different contributors, including Anish, who wrote like a huge amount of the front end. So over like a 4-month time period, this kind of ragtag group of part-time contributors developed the V1 of PartyBid. And the vision of it, like during those 4 months, just kind of kept getting like bigger and a bit more ambitious. So the crowdfund was talking about, and the proposal that John set forth was like, let's bring like a more full-featured version of this to testnet, which largely just seemed like a prototype and an experiment that we were going to build. But as we started building on it, we got really excited about it, and we saw a lot of potential for it, and we ended up being like, okay, no, let's actually take this to mainnet. Let's invest in a pretty polished UI, and let's take this group of people contributing their resources and really make something that we can bring a mainnet experience and see what people do with it. So after about 4 months of part-time building it, it was ready and we released it, and it allowed people to pool funds together to participate in Zora auctions and foundation auctions as a group, where people could pool money together, bid in these auctions, and then if they won the auction, the NFT would be fractionalized and distributed proportionally to everybody who contributed. And then this was all done on top of this pretty consumer friendly, fun interface with these multiplayer cursors and like kind of like special like character and aesthetic to the whole thing as well. So when we launched, we were really not expecting and very pleased with like a huge amount of action that we got in a short amount of time. So a lot of money was spent, like millions of dollars in the first week, where people bought a zombie punk together, and everyone on Twitter changed their photo to that zombie punk after like a huge amount of contributors won that punk. And then we saw people using PartyBid for things which we didn't expect as well, where we saw Sirsu, for example, start the crypto cookout, where we was hosting these Twitter spaces and talking about, we want to buy black and brown punks off the punks floor because we don't think it's right that black and brown punks should be the ones that are the cheapest on the market. So let's buy them as a group, and then we can like help deliver value to them and potentially profit from them in the future as well. So seeing that like have an element of social justice to it, seeing that this was like giving access to assets that people might not have had access to before because they couldn't purchase a whole one by themselves, was really motivating to the team. And then since then, we've seen a lot of novel different things happen on PartyBid, which we could have never anticipated, like the Twin Flames photograph being auctioned off to kick off Raw DAO, like Ukraine DAO starting from auctioning an NFT of Ukrainian flag as like a fundraising mechanism. So what started off as like an interesting prototype on a kind of new way to coordinate turned out to have these like bigger kind of like social justice and community formation like implications that was just really motivating to see once we got the product out in the wild. So since then, we recognized that this thing was a lot bigger than a 25 ETH mirror crowdfund, and we recognized that the PartyBid V1 that we've released is like shows a lot of promise and product market validation, but it also showed us that this kind of like primitive of a group acting together on chain is a really big concept. That's a primitive that deserves to be given kind of first-class treatment in the Ethereum ecosystem, and we think that we're uniquely poised to build out that primitive. So since then, we migrated to a new token. We closed a fundraising round. We have a team of full-time contributors that are working to develop what internally we're calling PartyBid V2, which has been in the works for a while now, that is really working hard to create the best version of kind of a group action primitive on the Ethereum blockchain, which I'm very excited about.
I changed my PFP to a zombie. I was part of all those sort of things. And I think there's like this, it felt like very much like definitely a new primitive that it was really interesting to see how many different ways folks were using it. As you think forward to V2, are you sort of like doubling down on enabling some of those things that have sort of emerged from early users? Or so I guess, is that vision sort of the same, or are there sort of net new games that we're going to be able to play with these things?
So we have like done a lot of user interviews and spoken to a lot of people who have used PartyBid, like the Ukraine DAO folks and Sirsu. There was also like quite a few different music video NFTs minted on Zora that like PartyBid got traction with as well as people just like speculating on like other kind of random NFTs as well. So we've done pretty thorough user interviews and try to understand the different use cases that people are using PartyBid for right now. So I'll say that like our design for PartyBid V2, we're keeping somewhat close to our chest because I think part of the success of PartyBid V1 was just kind of introducing this net new thing that people weren't expecting or necessarily had heard of before, and then releasing it like with like some pretty interesting and big initiatives associated with it from day one. It comes back to what I was talking about with Zoo Token, right? It's like one thing to be like, hey, here's a platform. It's another thing to be like, hey, here's a platform and here's some canonical use cases that really show the power of that platform. So we have some like kind of canonical use cases that we're going to like launch and kind of showcase when we get PartyBid V2 out the door, and they are informed by all the usage that we've seen to date, but there's definitely going to be some kind of like new games to play with the system that weren't really enabled by PartyBid V1. Yeah, it's going to be exciting to see come out.
It was my way of trying to get the alpha out of you, Steve, but well done. Good defense. We have to wait and see. Like the rest of us, I'm sure, all of a sudden it'll be all over our Twitter accounts. And who knows, might spark the next mini bull run that saves all of these centralized DeFi mullet projects out here. One can hope. One can hope. It's great to have somebody who's just, your hands are in the dirt here in so many interesting ways. And yeah, it's been wonderful to sort of see you build. Loved using so many of the tools that you've put out into the world. Makes me wonder what is next. And of course, you're not telling us what's next, so we'll have to wait and see what's next, which ultimately is exciting. I'm all about that. Where's the best place for people to sort of follow your work?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Twitter, Steve KLBNF on Twitter. And then also you can check out nextepoch.com to learn more about like the angel investing and DeFi stuff that I do along with my wife, Brianna.
Well, I appreciate your time, man. And let's try not to have 2 years in between when we chat.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, you've been in the Discords and in the crowd funds and been a supporter of a lot of the different projects that I've worked on. So I greatly appreciate that. So thank you for all your support.
Right on. Thanks, Steve.
All right, take it easy, man.